Most people think a wedding is defined by white dresses, church bells, and a room full of smiling faces. They think of family gatherings, champagne toasts, and promises made in the safe, predictable light of the civilian world. But when you are a ghost, when you are a shadow that has been officially erased from the United States military's active duty history, a wedding is something else entirely. It isn't a celebration. It is a high-stakes tactical operation. It is a vow whispered in the blind spots of national intelligence, written in the invisible ink of absolute loyalty, and sealed with the terrifying certainty that you would take a bullet for the person standing across from you. My name is Elias Miller. A year ago, I was just a standard-issue Apache pilot stationed at Fort Campbell, thinking my world was defined by flight hours, tactical checklists, and the predictable hierarchy of the chain of command. Today, my fingers are brushing against a small, cold titanium ring tucked deep inside the survival pocket of my flight suit, and I am looking at a woman who used to be a ghost, but who somehow became my entire universe. The civilian world and the mainstream media thought the Shadow Peak conspiracy ended on that blood-soaked mountain retreat. They thought that after General Richard Sterling leaked the unredacted files to the international press, the corrupt defense contractors and rogue intelligence assets simply packed up their bags and vanished into thin air. They thought justice was a clean, swift stroke. But if my 10 years in the cockpit have taught me anything, it's this. A cornered beast doesn't run, it strikes back with twice the venom. And our quiet, off-the-grid wedding was about to become the ultimate kinetic battleground for the dying remnants of a compromised empire. To understand how we got to this chapel in the middle of the Kentucky wilderness, you have to understand what happened after the dust settled from the Shadow Peak operation. When the Pentagon offered Sarah Vance a Tier 1 operational slot, a full reinstatement of her rank, and a clean slate with enough black-budget money to disappear anywhere on Earth, she didn't take it. She didn't want a beach in the South Pacific or a cushy consulting job in Washington. Instead, she chose to stay right where she felt safe, under the grease-stained, heavy metal belly of my Apache helicopter. She chose the quiet, grinding routine of a line mechanic, hiding her lethal black operations past behind a pair of coveralls and a toolbox. For 6 months, Sarah and I worked in a silent, feverish rhythm. To the rest of the 101st Airborne, we were just a pilot and his dedicated crew chief. But beneath that professional surface, the air between us was constantly pulled tight, like a tripwire wired to a claymore mine. We didn't talk about that fateful night in Hangar 4. We didn't talk about the silent salute from General Sterling that changed everything. We didn't talk about the faceless men in tailored suits who still watched our perimeter from unmarked SUVs outside the base gates. But every single time our hands brushed while passing a specialized tool, or every time our eyes locked through the green-tinted night vision HUD during a post-maintenance test flight, the logic was undeniable. The bond between us wasn't just professional, and it wasn't just emotional. It was a horizontal logic of survival. We were the only 2 people alive who knew the exact depth of the shadows we had escaped. It happened on a rainy Tuesday night at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the exact same hour our lives had collided months prior. The base was dead silent, swallowed whole by the thick, rolling Kentucky fog. Hangar 4 was a cavern of white LED light and deep, empty space. Sarah was packing up her heavy-duty Pelican cases, her movements deliberate and calm. I walked up to her workbench, my boots echoing softly against the polished concrete. I didn't say a word at first. I just watched her. The way she held herself, always defensive, always calculating the nearest exit, always the Raven. "You're late logging off the maintenance manifest, Sergeant," I said, keeping my voice low, barely above a whisper. She didn't look up immediately. Her hands remained completely steady as she wiped down a heavy steel wrench. "Precision doesn't follow a standard military clock, Elias. You know your left engine intake has a microscopic vibration at 4,000 RPM. The automated diagnostics missed it. I didn't." I didn't notice the vibration, I replied, stepping directly into her line of sight, forcing her to look at me. But I noticed something else, something much more dangerous. She finally stopped. She laid the wrench down on the black rubber mat of the workbench and lifted her head. That 1,000-yard, hyper-observant combat stare that usually defined her eyes suddenly softened. For the first time, the walls she built to protect herself from the world came down, even if only by a millimeter. I reached into the pocket of my flight suit. My hand was shaking, a sensation I hadn't felt since my first active combat deployment over the mountains of Afghanistan. I pulled out the small, unpolished silver ring. It didn't have a diamond. It didn't come from a luxury storefront in the city. I had forged it myself, secretly, using a high-grade titanium hydraulic seal salvaged from the very same Apache helicopter that we had used to fight our way out of the Shadow Peak ambush. It was a piece of military hardware turned into a promise. I signed a lifetime non-disclosure agreement with the Department of Defense regarding what we did, Sarah, I said, my voice dropping into a rough, quiet gravity. I can't tell the world who you are. I can't tell my family what you sacrificed or how you saved my life. I can't give you a normal name or a normal life under the sun. But I want to spend every single second of my remaining time on this earth protecting the person standing right next to me. I don't want to be your pilot anymore. I want to be your anchor. Will you marry me? Sarah looked down at the titanium band resting in my palm. For 5 agonizing seconds, she didn't breathe. The silence in Hangar 4 became absolute. Then, slowly, a genuine, heartbreakingly beautiful smile touched her lips, a smile that completely erased the scars of her past. She looked up, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned right through me. "On one absolute condition, Captain," she whispered, her voice dropping into that dangerous, teasing tone I had grown to love. "If the engine fails on our way into the dark, I'm the one who fixes it. You just fly the bird." "Copy that, Sergeant," I whispered. But as I slipped the titanium ring onto her finger, neither of us realized that the shadow network we had crossed wasn't done with us. Our vows wouldn't be traded in peace. They were about to be baptized in fire. The transition from a ghost asset to a domestic baseline is a psychological decompression that civilian textbooks cannot adequately describe. For Sarah Vance, the process was not about healing, it was about calibration. When you have spent years operating in the deep black sectors of national intelligence, where your name is a fluid variable and your survival depends on a total absence of a digital footprint, the sudden gift of a clean record feels less like freedom and more like a tactical trap. You do not simply sit in a suburban living room and drink coffee when your muscle memory is permanently wired to scan for the glare of an optical lens or the specific drag of an unmapped surveillance vehicle. That was why she chose the motor pool. The mechanical layout of a twin-engine attack helicopter follows an absolute, uncompromising horizontal logic. A component either meets torque specification or it fails. A hydraulic line either holds 3,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, or it ruptures. In the hangar, there were no double agents, no redacted mission manifests, and no shifting political directives. There was only steel, aluminum, and the predictable physics of flight. For the 6 months following the formal declassification of the Shadow Peak documents, our interaction on the flight line was governed by a strict, unwritten code. To the command staff at Fort Campbell, we were a textbook pilot and crew chief pairing. I was the officer responsible for the tactical employment of the aircraft. She was the non-commissioned officer responsible for its structural integrity. We kept our distance during morning formations. We utilized standard military terminology over the maintenance logs, but every morning, when I performed the pre-flight walk-around inspection of tail number 7 Echo Niner, the evidence of her silent vigilance was undeniable. The safety wire on the main rotor hub was always pitched at a perfect 45-degree angle. The canopy seals were pristine. The fast-acting valves on the fuel cells were polished until they reflected the harsh hangar lights like mirrors. It was her way of communicating without using a secure radio channel. Every turn of her wrench was a silent transmission. I am still here. I am still watching the perimeter. You are clear to fly. The proposal in the dark, empty expanse of Hangar 4 had changed the structural geometry of our relationship, but it had not diminished the threat matrix. The moment Sarah accepted the titanium ring, we both knew we were operating on borrowed time. The corporate remnants of the Shadow Peak contracting network had lost their primary government access when General Richard Sterling leaked the unredacted files, but the infrastructure of a multi-billion-dollar private intelligence firm does not dissolve overnight. The shell companies merely shifted their assets offshore. The wet work teams went into deep concealment, waiting for the political news cycle to move on. 2 weeks before our scheduled ceremony, a subtle shift occurred in the atmospheric telemetry around us. It began with an unauthorized data sweep on the base housing registry, a minor anomaly that the automated cybersecurity network flagged as a routine ping, but one that Sarah identified immediately as a deliberate reconnaissance probe. 3 days later, a nondescript commercial courier vehicle was logged idling for 42 minutes outside the perimeter fence of the training sector where I was conducting low-altitude night vision training. We did not report it through standard military channels. To do so would involve triggering a formal counterintelligence investigation that would inevitably exhume Sarah's erased operational history, drawing the exact type of high-level scrutiny we were trying to avoid. Instead, we adapted our flight plan. "We changed the venue," Sarah said one evening, not looking up from her workbench as she dismantled a complex fuel injector assembly. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but her fingers were moving with a rapid, rhythmic efficiency that signaled her internal threat assessment was at maximum capacity. "The military chapel on the main post is too exposed, too many access roads, too much electronic surveillance from the commercial corridors. If they want to close the loop on us, they'll do it where they can control the signal density." "I have a location," I replied, leaning against the heavy steel frame of the parts rack, keeping my eyes fixed on the hangar doors. "My grandfather's old parish on the edge of the Daniel Boone National Forest. It's a stone structure built in the late 19th century, thick limestone walls, single-access road with a clear 2-mile line of sight. No cellular towers within 5 miles. If anyone tries to establish a local surveillance loop, they have to do it via satellite or low-altitude physical insertion." Sarah stopped her wrench. She looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting the sharp, clinical glow of the overhead fluorescent arrays. For a fraction of a second, the cold, calculating expression of the raven faded, replaced by something deeply human, a flicker of raw vulnerability that she only ever showed to me. "A kinetic retirement plan disguised as a wedding venue, Captain?" "It's called defensive positioning, Sergeant," I said, a faint smile breaking through my exhaustion. "We don't go there to hide. We go there because if they try to cross the perimeter, we have the high ground." She nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture that finalized the operational order. "We need a clean transport chain, no digital signatures, no personal vehicles linked to our active duty profiles. We pull General Sterling into the loop. He's the only one with enough off-the-grid authority to move us without generating a digital footprint in the Pentagon's personnel tracking system." The execution of the plan was flawless in its isolation. General Sterling, true to his legacy of unyielding operational honor, handled the logistics through a series of secure analog channels that bypassed the modern military-industrial complex entirely. He secured an old, non-tactical utility transport from an inactive reserve depot, a vehicle with 0 GPS tracking modules and no automated diagnostic transmitters. The chaplain was a retired Army division priest from Sterling's early days in the Berlin Brigade, a man who had buried secrets in the cold mud of Western Europe and understood that some vows required an absolute absence of official documentation. On the morning of the departure, the Kentucky weather cooperated with our tactical needs. A massive, low-pressure system rolled across the state, bringing with it a dense, blinding fog that dropped physical visibility down to less than 50 yards. It was the exact type of weather that grounded commercial aviation and rendered standard satellite optics completely useless. As we loaded the utility transport in the blind spots of the base surveillance cameras, Sarah looked at the gray horizon, her face set in stone. "The air is too heavy," she murmured, her hand instinctively checking the concealed compartment inside her field jacket where her sterile sidearm was secured. "The radar profiles are going to be completely distorted today. If someone wants to move a low-signature asset without being noticed by air traffic control, this is the exact window they would choose." "Then we make sure we're inside the stone walls before the fog clears," I said, putting the vehicle into gear. We drove into the gray abyss, leaving the relative safety of Fort Campbell behind. We were moving toward an altar, but every instinct in my combat-trained brain told me we were driving directly into the heart of an ambush. The silent code that had kept us alive in the shadows was about to face its ultimate stress test. The limestone walls of St. Jude's Parish were 4 feet thick, built by hand in the late 19th century to withstand the brutal winters of the Appalachian foothills. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone, ancient cedar wood, and the faint, bitter trace of burnt candle wax. It was an environment completely detached from the modern tactical world, a place where time seemed to have stopped a century ago. Yet, as I stood near the altar in my dress blues, the tight wool of the uniform felt less like a ceremonial garment and more like a restrictive layer of body armor. My eyes were not fixed on the altar, nor on the old, weathered chaplain who was quietly adjusting his vestments. My eyes were tracking the narrow, leaded glass windows that lined the upper nave of the church. Sarah stood at the back of the small sanctuary, waiting for the signal to walk down the short stone aisle. She wore a simple white dress, devoid of the lace and heavy trains typical of civilian weddings. It was a utilitarian garment, modified by her own hands over the past 72 hours. Beneath the heavy fabric of the skirt, strapped securely to the lateral aspect of her left calf, sat her suppressed, matte black sidearm. Her hair was pulled back tightly, exposing the sharp, angular lines of her jaw and the small, faded scar just below her left ear, a reminder of the operational extraction that had nearly claimed her life during the Shadow Peak collapse. She did not carry flowers. Her hands were empty, loose, and perfectly positioned near her centerline, ready to drop into a standard combat draw in a fraction of a second. General Richard Sterling sat alone in the front pew, his 3-star dress uniform immaculate, his chest covered in rows of campaign ribbons that represented 40 years of unyielding service to the Republic. He sat with his hands resting flat on his knees, his posture rigid. To an outside observer, he looked like a proud mentor witnessing the union of 2 of his finest soldiers. But I knew the man. I knew the micro-expressions of his face. I could see the slight, rhythmic tension in his jaw and the way his eyes constantly flicked toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the chapel. He had established a secondary monitoring post 3 miles down the ridgeline with a team of trusted military police investigators, but in the thick, rolling fog that now completely encased the mountain, electronic signals were degraded by 40%. We were, for all practical purposes, entirely on our own. The chaplain stepped forward, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that echoed softly against the high timber ceiling. "Dearly beloved," he began, his eyes scanning our faces with the deep, non-judgmental understanding of a man who had ministered to soldiers in the valleys of Korea and the deserts of Iraq. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and in the presence of this witness to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The bond you seek to establish is one that requires absolute fidelity, an unyielding strength, and a willingness to endure the darkest trials the world can present." Just as the chaplain cleared his throat to initiate the formal vows, the atmospheric pressure inside the stone sanctuary shifted. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a physical sensation, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the iron fixtures holding the candles. My heart rate, which had remained steady at 62 beats per minute throughout my pre-flight checks and tactical deployments, spiked instantly. It was a familiar, predatory rhythm, the distinct, staggered thrum of modified, four-bladed main rotors slicing through heavy, moisture-laden air. An unmarked Blackhawk helicopter, operating with its transponder deactivated and its engine exhaust shrouded for acoustic dampening, was dropping out of the fog directly above the parish perimeter. "Down!" I roared, the command ripping from my throat with the force of a pre-flight warning before an impact. Before the echoes of my voice could fade against the stone, the leaded glass windows along the eastern wall shattered inward in a violent cascade of sharp, glittering shards. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel were blown off their hinges by a precise, linear breaching charge, the concussive blast filling the small sanctuary with gray smoke and the acrid smell of high explosives. 3 operatives shifted through the ruined doorway in a flawless, low-profile tactical stack. They were dressed in sterile, high-end commercial gear, completely devoid of national flags, unit patches, or identification tags. Their weapons were suppressed carbines fitted with high-intensity thermal optics designed to cut through the smoke and fog. This wasn't a reconnaissance probe. It was a maximum force liquidation team sent to erase the last human liabilities of the Shadow Peak enterprise. But the corporate cleanup squad had made a fatal error in their tactical calculus. They had planned to ambush an unarmed civilian couple at an altar. Instead, they had stepped into an enclosed kill zone with a Raven and a Reaper. Before the lead operative could establish a clear sightline through his thermal optic, Sarah moved with a fluid, terrifying speed that bypassed standard human reaction times. In a single sweeping motion, her white satin dress tearing at the seam as her right hand flashed down to her left ankle. Her fingers locked on to the grip of her sidearm, drawing it clear of the concealment holster before the dust from the breaching blast had even hit the floor. Pop. Pop. 2 highly compressed metallic cracks punctured the ringing silence of the room. The lead operative took both rounds directly in the center mass of his tactical vest, the kinetic impact throwing him backward into the doorframe and disrupting the forward momentum of the stack. General Sterling, acting with the reflexive instinct of an infantry officer who had survived the Cold War, threw his entire weight against the heavy oak altar rail, overturning a massive 200-pound cedar table to create an immediate ballistic-resistant barrier across the front pew. "Miller, secure the eastern flank. They're trying to establish an overlapping field of fire," Sterling shouted, pulling his own personal service weapon from beneath his dress jacket with a steady, unhurried hand. "Moving," I yelled, diving over the shattered remnants of the pew line into the side aisle. My hands locked on to the dropped carbine of the neutralized lead operative, my fingers automatically clearing the safety and checking the chamber logic in less than half a second. The remaining 2 operatives inside the doorway opened fire, their suppressed weapons emitting a rhythmic, metallic hiss as a hail of high-velocity rounds chewed into the limestone walls behind us, spraying us with a deadly shower of stone chips and plaster dust. Working in that same silent, feverish rhythm we had perfected under the belly of tail number 7 Echo Niner, Sarah and I executed a textbook crossfire maneuver. She held the high angle from behind the overturned altar, her shots deliberate, precise, and lethal, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. I advanced along the low deck, utilizing the shadows of the stone pillars to close the distance. Within 90 seconds of the initial breach, the interior of the chapel returned to a dead, absolute silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the 3 survivors and the distant, fading whine of the Blackhawk's turbines as the flight crew realized their ground element had been completely compromised. The echoes of the final gunshot bounced off the ancient limestone pillars, leaving behind a sharp, ringing void that was slowly filled by the crackle of burning electronics from the ruined doorways. The thick, gray fog from outside began to drift through the shattered stained glass windows, mixing with the white plaster dust and the acrid stench of cordite. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The structural integrity of the parish had held, but the sacred silence of the sanctuary had been completely shattered, transformed into a tactical perimeter. Sarah stood near the center aisle, her chest rising and falling in a controlled, rhythmic decompression. Her white dress was torn at the hem where she had dropped to make her shot, and a dark smear of weapon grease and carbon marked the fabric near her right hip. Her hand was still wrapped around the grip of her suppressed sidearm, her finger resting precisely along the frame, just above the trigger guard. Her eyes, cold and analytical, scanned the floor, tracking the neutralized targets to ensure there was no remaining threat. The transition from a bride waiting at an altar to the lethal operator known as the Raven had taken less than 2 seconds. General Richard Sterling was the first to break the defensive posture. He stepped out from behind the overturned cedar altar, his dress uniform slightly dusted with white plaster, but his movements completely unhurried. He walked toward the rear doors, his service weapon held low at his side. He glanced down at the tactical gear of the lead operative, using the toe of his polished dress shoe to turn over a discarded carbine. "Sterile equipment," Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried no trace of fear, only a deep, historical exhaustion. "No serial numbers on the receivers, no manufacturing marks on the communication arrays. This wasn't a standard military asset, Elias. This is a private liquidation detail, funded through the offshore accounts we flagged during the Shadow Peak audit. They knew their infrastructure was being disassembled by the federal courts this morning, and they wanted to balance the ledger before the cell doors closed." I stepped out from behind the stone pillar, lowering the captured rifle, but keeping my thumb on the safety lever. I walked over to Sarah, my boots crunching softly on the thousands of tiny glass fragments that covered the stone floor like ice. I reached out, my gloved hand gently touching her shoulder. The tension in her muscles was immense, a hard knot of survival reflex that took a long moment to dissolve under my touch. "Are you hit?" I asked, my voice rough, my eyes searching her face for any sign of injury. She looked up at me, her dark eyes reflecting the dull, gray light filtering through the broken windows. A very faint, dry smile appeared on her lips, the exact same smile she had given me in the dark corners of Hangar 4 when a repair manual didn't align with the reality of a broken machine. "They missed the baseline, Elias," she whispered, her voice steady but incredibly quiet. "They calculated for a civilian target. They forgot that when you hunt a raven, you don't bring a standard tracking team, you bring an army." She slowly holstered her weapon beneath the torn lace of her skirt, her movements deliberate. She looked around at the wreckage of the chapel, the shattered glass, the overturned pews, the dust settling over the ancient altar. "It isn't exactly the traditional ceremony your grandfather had in mind. It's an authentic reflection of our reality, Sarah," I replied, looking at her with a depth of certainty I had never felt before, even while guiding an attack helicopter through a heavy anti-aircraft network. We don't live in the light of the civilian world. We live in the space between the shadows, and this is exactly where we belong. General Sterling walked back toward the front of the sanctuary, his phone already in his hand as he coordinated with the arriving military police investigators who were breaching the lower ridgeline. "The perimeter is secure, Miller. The Blackhawk that dropped them has logged an unmapped flight plan toward the southern border, but civilian radar has already picked up their signature. They won't make it to international airspace. The network is completely dead." He stopped 3 feet from us, his iron-gray eyes shifting between my dress blues and Sarah's stained white dress. He looked at the wreckage around us, then back at the old military chaplain who was slowly stepping out from behind a massive limestone pillar near the vestry. The priest was shaking slightly, his old hands gripping his liturgical book, but his eyes held the unbreakable resolve of a man who had seen the true cost of service decades ago. "Chaplain," General Sterling said, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet, absolute command, "I believe your protocol was interrupted at the structural phase of the vows. The threats have been neutralized. The witnesses are present. Complete the log." The old priest blinked, clearing the dust from his eyes. He looked at the overturned cedar table, then at the 3 of us standing in the middle of a battlefield. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask why a bride carried a suppressed weapon or why a 3-star general was clearing a room with a service pistol. He simply nodded, stepped over a discarded equipment pack, and took his position in front of us, using the top of a broken pew as his temporary lectern. "Let us resume," the chaplain said, his voice gaining strength as the ancient words found their rhythm once more. "Captain Elias Miller, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you promise to stand by her in times of conflict and times of peace, to protect her perimeter, and to maintain your loyalty to her above all official directives until death claims your final assignment?" I looked directly into Sarah's eyes, ignoring the sound of distant sirens beginning to wail at the bottom of the mountain road. "I do," I said, the words clear, solid, and absolute. The chaplain turned his gaze to Sarah, his face softening with a profound respect. "Sarah Vance, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Do you promise to anchor him when the visibility is 0, to defend his flank, and to share your horizon with him through the dark sectors and the light until the final log is closed?" Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached out, her fingers locking into mine with a grip that felt like steel. "I do," she whispered. "By the authority vested in me as a servant of the Almighty and a minister of this church," the chaplain declared, placing his old hand over our joined fingers, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What has been forged in the fire of absolute loyalty, let no human agency attempt to tear asunder." I didn't wait for a formal cue. I stepped forward and kissed my wife amidst the ruins of St. Jude's Parish, the taste of salt and dust between us completely erased by the overwhelming realization that we had finally won our freedom. As we stepped apart, I reached into the upper pocket of my dress jacket. My fingers bypassed the titanium ring, which was already resting securely on her finger, and pulled out a small, faded piece of silver fabric. It was the original raven patch she had given me during our first high-stakes extraction, the silent symbol of her erased legacy. I placed it gently into her open palm. "You don't have to carry this in the dark anymore, Sarah," I said softly, my voice catching slightly. "You aren't a ghost hiding in a hangar. You're my wife. The raven has finally found her way home." She looked down at the patch, her fingers tracing the silver embroidery, before she looked back up at me, her eyes shining with a rare, beautiful warmth. "And the Reaper," she said, her voice dropping into a deep, affectionate whisper, "is finally clear for flight." We turned together and walked down the glass-covered aisle, our hands locked tightly, leaving the shadows of our past exactly where they belonged, neutralized on the floor behind us. Thank you for joining us for the thrilling conclusion of Elias and Sarah's journey. This story is a testament to the unbreakable bonds forged in the line of duty, where true loyalty is thicker than blood and stronger than any corrupt empire. If you think the Reaper and the Raven make the ultimate military power couple, please hit that like button right now and share this video with a fellow patriot who respects the uniform. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the untold tales of courage, justice, and military conspiracy. Before you go, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if a shadow agency attempted to crash your wedding? Stay sharp, stay loyal, and most importantly, stay vigilant. We'll see you in the next story.